U.S. Trotskyism, the Workers' World Party, Spartacist League, Workers' League, and their offshoots. From its inception, the Socialist Workers Party was the major Trotskyist organization in the United States. At least until the 1980s, it represented, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyism in the country. However, beginning in the early 1930s, there have always existed other parties, leagues, groups, etc., which have professed loyalty in varying degrees to Trotskyism. We have dealt with some of those early dissident groups in the first chapter on United States Trotskyism, and we have devoted 2 earlier chapters to the 1940 split in the Socialist Workers' Party and to the groups deriving more or less directly from the, quote, Shachtmanite, end quote, tendency. Let's swig some water here. In the present chapter, we shall deal with the Workers' World Party, Spartacist League, and Workers' League, which split from the Socialist Workers' Party in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and with all but one of the splinter groups having their origins in these 3. In the next chapter, we shall discuss other dissident Trotskyist groups and the strange development of the National Caucus of Labor Committees. Workers' World Party. Chronologically, the first of these dissident groups to break away from the Socialist Workers' Party was the Workers' World Party, which was established as noted earlier in 1959. Its principal figure was Sam Marcy. The Marcyites first emerged as the global class war tendency in the Socialist Workers' Party at the time of the 1948 presidential election. At that time, they urged the Socialist Workers' Party to support the candidacy of Henry Wallace, then running as the nominee of the Progressive Party. Soon after the outbreak of the Korean War, Sam Marcy issued a long internal document in the Socialist Workers' Party about that event entitled, quote, Memorandum on the Unfolding War and the Tasks of the Proletariat in the New Phase of the World Permanent Revolution, end quote. Sam Marcy argued that the Korean War was, quote, not a war between nations, but a war between the classes, end quote, a passage which he underscored. More significant in retrospect was Marcy's argument concerning the communist regime in China. After citing a prediction of Trotsky concerning the Chinese Revolution, Marcy wrote that, quote, of course, Trotsky had in mind a genuine communist party grounded in revolutionary Marxism and geared to the perspective of the world revolution, rather than the party of Mao Zedong and Chou Enlai. ... But then the latter have not been the architects and guides of the revolution, as was the case with the party of Lenin and Trotsky. On the contrary, the present Chinese leaders have been catapulted into power by the torrential revolutionary pressure of the Chinese peasants and workers, but theirs is nonetheless a dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, no matter how distorted and mutilated by Stalinist practices, dogmas, and perspectives, ... end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party at that point had not yet gotten around to recognizing the Chinese regime as a, quote, workers' state, end quote, and on this issue Marcy was clearly a dissident. However, Marcy's disagreements with the majority of the party leadership did not bring Marcy to break with the party at that time. Marcy supported the majority in the fight with the Cochranites. Marcy's next disagreement with the Socialist Workers' Party leadership came over the issue of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Unlike the Socialist Workers' Party majority, Marcy and his supporters attacked the uprising in Hungary as, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote. Once again, Marcy did not break away from the Socialist Workers' Party on this issue. It was not until early 1959 that the Marcyites finally left the Socialist Workers' Party to establish the Workers' World Party, WWP. In doing so, the Workers' World Party, the Marcyites, formed the Workers' World Party, clearly continued to regard themselves as Trotskyists. In the third issue of their monthly newspaper, Workers' World, the Marcyites editorialized, quote, "We are the Trotskyists. We stand 100% with all of the principal positions of Leon Trotsky, the most revolutionary communist since Lenin," end quote. According to the leaders of a small dissident faction which broke away from the Workers' World Party about 15 years after the Workers' World Party's establishment, at the Workers' World Party's inception, the party was, quote, "centered in key industrial areas," end quote, collectively represented probably the strongest working class base the Socialist Workers Party had developed to date. Moreover, the Workers' World Party combined the unique historical perspective of Trotskyism, read Marxism, with a keen understanding of how to apply that perspective to conditions existing in the world of 1959, end quote. At the Workers' World Party's inception, the Workers' World Party was, quote, "based largely in Buffalo, Youngstown, Seattle, and New York," end quote. From the establishment of the Workers' World Party, its favorite propaganda tactic was one of organizing street demonstrations, even before they became the favorite tactic of the New Left in the latter half of the 1960s. One Workers' World Party pamphlet celebrating the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the Workers' World Party noted that, quote, "They set to work in this early period organizing demonstrations in the very teeth of the bitter anti-communist backlash when much of the powerful workers' movement was scattered in disarray, ... Militant demonstrations were called in support of Patrice Lumumba, heroic Congolese liberation fighter, against racist discrimination practices in housing, against the repressive House Un-American Activities Committee of Congress," end quote. In April 1962, the Workers' World Party established a youth organization first known as the Anti-Fascist Youth Committee and subsequently the Youth Against War and Fascism. The same party document just cited noted their perspective in launching this group. It stated that, quote, "the task of organizing and building a revolutionary youth movement was seen as a high priority. The rebellions of students and working-class youth in almost every revolutionary situation throughout the world have almost always been symptomatic and the precursor of a general uprising of the proletariat and its allies. Workers' World Party conceived of an organization of such revolutionary youth," end quote. The Workers' World Party and the United... Youth Against War and Fascism. Where am I? The World Workers' Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism threw themselves early into the struggle against growing United States involvement in Vietnam. The Workers' World Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism claimed to have organized the first demonstration against the war on August 3rd, 1962, quote, "at a time when most Americans hadn't yet heard of Vietnam, ... end quote. The Youth Against War and Fascism and the Workers' World Party were very proud of the fact that Ho Chi Minh, in an interview with Wilfred Burchett, had said that, quote, "we appreciate such actions as that of American Youth Against War and Fascism who recently demonstrated against the, quote, undeclared war," end quote. "Such activities are known here and greatly hearten our people," end quote. Again, I want to recommend No Vaughn's work about the left opposition in Vietnam. And its relation to the Stalinists under Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Workers' World Party activity in the anti-war movement was not confined to street demonstrations. Two Youth Against War and Fascism leaders were among those people indicated for draft evasion: Deirdre Griswold and Marianne Weissman. of Youth Against War and Fascism, worked with the London Secretariat of the Bertrand Russell International War Crimes Tribunal for several months. At Fort Still, Oklahoma, they organized demonstrations at the time of the trial of Andy Stapp for, quote, for refusing to surrender anti-war literature, end quote. Out of that demonstration came the organization of the American Servicemen's Union, described somewhat enthusiastically by the Workers' World Party as being, quote, a mass organization of rank-and-file servicemen and women, dependents and veterans opposed to war, racism, and the privileged officer caste, with members on U.S. bases around the globe, end quote. The American Servicemen's Union was completely dominated by the Workers' World Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism. A group who broke with the Workers' World Party late in 1971 wrote that, quote, the bureaucratic structure of Youth Against War and Fascism was clearly reflected in the union office. Every prominent union leader was a comrade, or rather a party functionary, and if they had ever been GIs, they had long since forgotten it. They related to servicemen only through the party line and the party leadership, ... end quote. The Workers' World Party and Youth Against War and Fascism involved themselves in various other movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, as their 15th anniversary leaflet said, quote, we hit the streets to defend the heroic black uprisings in Watts, Newark, Detroit, Harlem, and other large cities, often while the black community was under martial law and the police were riding shotgun on the demonstrations, end quote. A Youth Against War and Fascism leader, Tom Soto, was asked by the Attica prison rioters to come into the prison and present their grievances for them. The party participated in various women's lib demonstrations as well. The Workers' World Party took a part in the continuing struggles over racial integration, particularly in the schools during the 1970s. The most spectacular activity in this field was in the march and demonstration organized by pro-integration elements in Boston in 1975 to protest strong-arm efforts by opponents of integration to thwart court orders in that city. It makes me think of the opening montage of The Departed, where it's showing a bunch of street fighting from the busing era in Boston. K. Martin has indicated the role which the Workers' World Party and the Youth Against War and Fascism saw themselves as playing in the Boston situation. Quote, I personally was one of the organizers of the historic Boston March Against Racism last year, which turned the tide against the wave of racist violence in that city. And it was the collective efforts of many hundreds of comrades who joined the march organization and gave the march all their attention and creative energy which made the emergency march possible, ... Many considered the march an impossible task, yet it was done, and 28,000 people came out, and it had the immediate measurable effect of demoralizing the racist and allowing those fighting racism to stand up. Even in South Boston, where a committee of black and white parents jointly greeted the bus students to the school in South Boston the week after the march, whereas the week before there were constant racist clashes, ... end quote. The Workers' World Party carried on an extensive program of literature distribution. In addition to its newspaper, Workers' World, the Workers' World Party published and distributed numerous books and pamphlets under the imprint of Worldview Publishers. For instance, in the winter of 1973 to 76, the party was selling, among other things, publications on the Portuguese Revolution, The Gay Question, a Marxist appraisal, Vince Copeland's Southern Populism and Black Labor, studies of the Allende regime in Chile, The Massacre of the Communists of Indonesia, Welfare, World Hunger, Puerto Rican Nationalism, and a variety of works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. During the 1970s, the Workers' World Party also undertook work in the organized labor movement. K. Martin has written that, quote, a large number of our comrades are active in their shops and have gained the workers' respect in the struggles on the shop floor. Many have been elected to positions of steward, shop chairman, or chairwoman, or other positions from which they can further the workers' struggle. Organizing drives, strikes, and strike support, are also a very important part of our development as a factor in the struggle of labor in this period of outbacks and unemployment, end quote. However, there is no evidence that the Workers' World Party gained control at any union level. The Workers' World Party had, by the 1970s, developed a unique way of dealing with specific kinds of issues. They were organized within the party, quote, caucuses, end quote, made up of members with particular backgrounds and interests. K. Martin has noted that by the mid-1970s, these included, quote, the Women's Caucus, Third World Caucus, Black, Latin, Chicano, and other Third World comrades, Gay Caucus, end quote. In 1980, the Workers' World Party adopted what was for it a new tactic. It ran candidates for office in the national election of that year. Deirdre Griswold, editor of Workers' World since 1971, and Larry Holmes, a Black Party leader, were named for president and vice president. The Workers' World Party also put up Tom Soto, a one-time leader of the American Servicemen's Union, as its candidate for the U.S. Senate in New York State. Lydia Bayonota as nominee for the House of Representatives in upstate New York, and Preston Wood, quote, an activist for homosexual rights, end quote, for the state assembly in a lower Manhattan district. The Workers' World national candidates campaigned for almost a year throughout the country. In California, they ran in the primary of the Peace and Freedom Party, where their opponents were Benjamin Spock of the People's Party, Gus Hall of the Communist Party, David McReynolds of the Socialist Party. The Workers' World Party nominees came in last, getting 1,232 out of 9,092 votes cast in the primary. The Workers' World Party claimed to have gotten its candidates on the ballot in a dozen states. In the 1984 elections, the Workers' World Party first supported the campaign of Jesse Jackson to get the Democratic Party nomination for president. When Jesse Jackson did not succeed, they again named their own candidates for president and vice president, Larry Holmes and Gloria La Riva. They also had a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Michigan, one nominee each for the U.S. House of Representatives in New York and California, and candidates for state legislatures in New York and Michigan. Holmes and La Riva were officially reported to have gotten 15,220 votes. The longer-range perspectives of how the Workers' World Party people have seen themselves is well summed up by K. Martin as by anyone else. K. Martin has said that, quote, it is this rich experience in struggles which recommends us as Marxist-Leninists, coupled with a revolutionary and thoroughly working-class world outlook, one of support for all socialist countries and national liberation movements against imperialism. This experience has prepared us to take on the very difficult tasks which lie ahead. Under the present economic conditions, the outbreak of the mass struggle is inevitable. It is only a matter of time. Our task is to prepare ourselves through the small struggles and not so small struggles of today and yesterday for the larger ones of tomorrow, end quote. The Workers' World Party and Maoism. Although starting their existence being by their own lights, quote, the Trotskyist, end quote, within a relatively short period, the Workers' World Party abandoned virtually all, quote, public, end quote, adherence to Trotsky, Trotsky's doctrines, and Trotsky's movement. For more than a decade, the Workers' World Party were apparently more Maoist than Trotskyist. There were probably several reasons for this ideological, quote, deviation, end quote. For one thing, Sam Marcy, for almost a decade before launching his own splinter party, had been much more sympathetic towards the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong's leadership than was the case with most Trotskyists. I wonder if any of these people knew who Chen Dushou was or Wang Fanxi. With the evolution of events, this aspect of his thinking became intensified. In the second place, soon after the launching of the Workers' World Party, the estrangement between the Soviet and Chinese leaderships began to become obvious, and like all far left groups, like the Workers' World Party leadership had to take a position. Um, if one is curious, one should look up Mao Zedong's comments about basically the merits of a nuclear holocaust to other members of the world communist movement at this time. It's embarrassing stuff and horrific. Unlike many of them, they had, in view of their own past, no hesitation about taking the Chinese side. It is also possible, as some of their critics allege, that they for a while had some hope of receiving the U.S. quote franchise end quote from the Chinese Communist leadership. Finally, as dissidents who broke away from the Workers' World Party in the early 1970s alleged, it may well be true that Marcy and his associates found the burden of the Trotskyist tradition too heavy an impediment in their recruiting efforts in the early years of the party's existence. They had taken out with them all of the Socialist Workers Party members who generally sympathized with their main points of view. The general atmosphere in the labor movement and among intellectuals was a conservative one, not conducive to recruiting people to the ideas of maverick Trotskyist group. Okay, 1 second. If you're interested in the relationship between Trotskyism and Mao's China, I would highly encourage you to explore the work of a person named Promise Lee, Promisel space Li, and Gregor Benton, Gregor space Brenton. Gregor Benton, in particular, has a lecture on the history of Chinese Trotskyism on YouTube at some university in Spain, I believe, and it's very, very informative. Also, they have a lecture on the book by Wang Fan Shi, which is a collection of essays put out by Haymarket Books. Wang Fan Shi was a Chinese Trotskyist done by the people I just mentioned, with others involved as well. Discussing the history of the Chinese radical left before and after the Revolution of 1949. Hence, the principal potential recruiting ground for the new Workers' World Party was among those who had largely, as a result of the events of 1956, had abandoned the Communist Party and its periphery. Which is ironic, since one of the main thing that caused the people to abandon the communist parties in 1956 were the same reasons that made Sam Marcy and the people who would go on to form the Workers' World Party an exception within Trotskyism. People left the party because of the invasion of Hungary by Soviet troops. And it's funny that the group around the Workers' World Party opposed that uprising, and to my understanding, probably if they opposed that uprising as counter-revolutionary and they viewed the government as revolutionary, they supported the invasion and the putting down of that uprising. So it's kind of ironic that the the principal, what it says here, the principal potential recruiting ground for the new Workers' World Party was among those who largely as a result of the events of 1956 had abandoned the Communist Party and its periphery. But these people were traditionally hostile to Trotskyism. As a consequence, the Workers' World Party dissidents subsequently argued, quote, Workers' World soon found it necessary not only to drop Trotsky's name from its organ, but to drop Trotskyist literature from the Workers' World Party bookshelves in the New York City headquarters, end quote. This turn away from formal commitment to Trotskyism continued, a fact reflected in the 1975 supplement to Workers' World featuring the literature of the party which it was then selling. In his 4-page document, there is no mention of any works by Trotsky, although there are numerous writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and even Vo Nguyen Giap and Kwame Nkrumah. The only publication of a Trotskyist nature is perhaps one by, quote, Mandel, end quote. No indication whether this is by Ernest Mandel on, quote, Soviet women, end quote. During most of the first dozen years of its existence, the Workers' World Party's orientation was one of particularly class support for the Chinese Communist Party and regime. In 1976, Deirdre Griswold wrote an article summarizing the party's attitude towards China since the Workers' World Party's inception. Deirdre Griswold noted that in their relations to the Chinese Revolution, the party had always had, quote, the kind of political independence that enables revolutionaries to speak up if they see that cause being damaged by the policies of leaders of socialist countries subject to the tremendous pressure of hostile imperialism, end quote. Griswold added, however, that, quote, this has not prevented it from being the most enthusiastic fighter for the Chinese Revolution, especially in those years when the masses in China were sweeping away one entrenched institution of class society after another, and when China's international policies were more and more providing a rallying point for the world working class and the liberation movements in the struggle against imperialism, end quote. The Workers' World Party also supported the Great Cultural Revolution. Deirdre Griswold noted that, quote, in all the great bourgeois revolutions and in the first proletarian revolution in backward Russia, the period of intense forward motion was followed by a decline and a partial reaction, ... In China, this period of reaction was anticipated by the revolutionary leadership who called on the masses to meet and defeat it with the great proletarian cultural revolution, end quote. Deirdre Griswold added that, quote, in a series of articles in Workers' World, Sam Marcy explained that the Cultural Revolution was a genuinely leftist development that found inspiration in the first workers' government, the Paris Commune, and that it was responding to the rise of restorationist elements in China, ... end quote. It's seriously fucking blasphemy. I would really recommend, if anyone's interested in this topic, of what was the content of the so-called Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in the PRC, is the lecture by Lauren Goldner on the Chinese working class in the contemporary crisis, or whatever it's called. It's called something like that, where he describes why he doesn't like the term cultural revolution, because it's nothing to do with culture, and it wasn't a revolution. It was a faction fight at the top of the party, because Mao, for more or less, was maintained only as a figurehead after his disastrous insistence upon the Great Leap Forward, where somewhere between 20 and 50 million people died. Some people say it's as low as 15 million. Some people say it's as 55 million. And 2 million people ended up dying in the Cultural Revolution, which makes China. Granted, China is huge, so I don't know how this is how this statistic is squared for figures. I mean, in terms of proportion. But the People's Republic of China under Mao was responsible for more deaths of its population than any other state in history. If you read just a textbook, if you read just any of the handbooks on the Chinese Revolution that are put out by academic presses, they will concur with this statement. It's not just Cold Warrior stuff or some shit like that. However, as Deirdre Griswold explained, the Workers' World Party did not accept the Chinese description of the Soviet Union as, quote, social imperialist, end quote. Deirdre Griswold claimed that, quote, this new class characterization of the Soviet Union by the Chinese Communist Party, opened the door to a U.S.-China rapprochement, end quote. Clearly, the Workers' World Party did not support this. Griswold noted that, quote, the tragic end of Lin Biao, former defense minister and a successor to Mao according to the Chinese constitution, and the disappearance of his associates marked the end of an entire stage of the Chinese Revolution, end quote. Griswold cited Marcy as writing that, quote, peaceful coexistence and accommodation with the West is what Mao proposed as the new foreign policy, This is what the, quote, radical faction, end quote, rejected and opposed. They were vanquished as earlier opponents of peaceful accommodation with the West were vanquished in the long period following Lenin's death in the Soviet Union, end quote. As to the policies followed by the Chinese party and regime after 1971, Deirdre Griswold concluded that, quote, proletarian revolutionaries can only be saddened by and opposed to such harmful policies and promote, in the words of Ho Chi Minh, the, quote, restoration of unity among the fraternal parties on the basis of Marxism-Leninism and proletarian internationalism in a way which conforms to both reason and sentiment, end quote, end quote. The Workers' World Party became increasingly critical of the Chinese leadership after Mao's death and the fall of the, quote, Gang of Four, end quote. Marcy summed up the party's position in June 1978 when he wrote that, quote, under Mao there was a deep contradiction between his struggle to continue the process of reforming China's social and political institutions on a revolutionary basis and his reactionary foreign policy in relation to the USSR and other socialist countries, What is not fully understood is that the current leaders are bent on, quote, harmonizing, end quote, the domestic situation with their foreign policy. But the resolution of this truly fundamental contradiction is a reactionary one that is, they are attacking the revolutionary domestic achievements of the Mao era, end quote. If you're curious, there's a very good YouTube channel hosted by the historian of China from Germany, Felix Wimhoyer, called Studying Maoist China, where he interviews basically top scholars in the field of scholarship on the Mao era, and including scholars of contemporary People's Republic of China. He has a series of like an introduction that's basically like an overview of the history of the PRC, and if you're unfamiliar with that trajectory, I highly recommend you watch those videos. Also, to give some of his like cool guy credentials, Felix Wimhoyer writes for the left undogmatic left journal, Jungle World in Germany, on issues about China. Uh, he also is, at least in the interview that he has with, I think it's Ralph or Wolf Ruckus on the channel, who is a German activist and author who wrote a book called The Capitalist Road to Communism, um, about worker struggles in contemporary China and how they stem from kind of the big changes that have been happening in China over the last 30 years. But he described him as a friend. And if you don't know who, I believe, I'm not exactly sure, but I think Rolf Ruckus is in some capacity affiliated with, maybe I'm wrong, so don't quote me on this, maybe affiliated with Wildcat Germany, which to my understanding, and also to Angry Workers World, which to my understanding was a branch of the German left, which drew inspiration from autonomism, Italian autonomism, and are deeply focused on producing detailed empirical critical studies of contemporary labor disputes. And he described Rolf in that Ruckus in that interview as an old friend. He also Felix Wimhoyer also has they're in German, so I haven't listened to them, but he also has talks with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So he's not just some kind of cold warrior. He also has a very detailed discussion, detailed within like half an hour if you're interested in this history of global Maoism, its rise and its peak in maybe the 1970s and late 1960s, and its decline in the last quarter of the 20th century, and he gives a couple of reasons why he thinks that is the case. But I highly recommend his YouTube channel. I actually can't recommend it enough, and to be a little patronizing, the guy's kind of like, his mannerisms are so well, I watched it with I have like a group of people. I'm at a college, and I have a group of people that we discussed topics of socialist history and the critique of political economy, and just philosophy, theory, history, and all those kinds of things. It's basically just a discussion group to have people talk about topics as a and it's not like an activist group, but we're watching videos of watching like some lectures by Felix Wimhoyer. And he would just do really cute things. Like when he said goodbye, he was like, bye bye. And it was funny. I hope that's not patronizing or disrespectful to Germans speaking English, but it was fun. Anyway, distinguished scholar. Really recommend his work. He also wrote a book of the social history of China, so check that shit out. Anyway. Remnants of Trotskyism and Workers' World Party's transformation into a Maoist party. Remnants of Trotskyism and Workers' World Party ideology. Space. Deep breath. In spite of the Workers' World Party's transformation into a Maoist party, however dissident, and its abandonment of all formal relationship with Trotskyism, there did remain certain residual Trotskyist elements in the Workers' World Party's philosophy. Or ideology. They still maintained a more or less orthodox Trotskyist position, if perhaps a somewhat exaggerated one, on the question of the nature of the Soviet Union and other Communist Party-controlled states. Marcy summed up his position of the Workers' World Party in an article in May 1976. Marcy wrote that, quote, "We, of course, believe neither that there is a new exploiting class in the Soviet Union, nor that there has been a return to the bourgeoisie to power there under the guide of Marxist-Leninist phraseology. We firmly adhere to the position that the USSR is a workers' state, although it has undergone a severe strain, deterioration, and erosion of revolutionary principles, and is moreover headed by a privileged and absolutist bureaucracy which limits, distorts, and has on many occasions endangered the very existence of the socialist forms of organization in the USSR, ... End quote. Sam Marcy continued, quote, the underlying social system of the USSR is infinitely superior to that of the most developed, the most, quote, glorious, and most, quote, democratic of the imperialist states. Whatever the drawbacks of the Soviet Union, whatever the Soviet Union's trials and tribulations, whatever false policies have been imposed on the USSR by its leaders, it has nevertheless been able to achieve tremendous social, cultural, and material progress for the masses, which no capitalist state could possibly have accomplished in the circumstances under which the USSR was originally founded and developed. Indeed, the USSR is rooted in a socialist system superior to the capitalist system. One sec. Indeed, the USSR is rooted in a socialist system superior to the capitalist system. It is our fundamental political position that regardless of the Soviet bureaucracy, the USSR contains a new social formation. Based on a historically superior mode of production, it is progressive in relation to monopoly capitalism in the same way that capitalism was a superior system in relation to feudalism, as indeed feudalism was a higher social system than slavery. End quote. Sam Marcy. The Spartacist League. I was going to take some guesses about the Spartacist League, but I won't. Founding the Spartacist League. As a consequence of the factional struggle which raged within the Socialist Workers Party between 1961 and 1964, two dissident groups emerged, the Spartacist League and the Workers' League, both of which continued to exist almost a quarter century later. In an earlier chapter, we have discussed some of the details of this struggle within the Socialist Workers' Party. Here we will trace the trajectory of the two groups once they were outside the Socialist Workers' Party. Those dissidents who continued the revolutionary tendency who were to form the Spartacist League were the first group to be expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party as a consequence of the factional fight. On November 1st, 1963, the Socialist Workers' Party Political Committee adopted a resolution, the operative portion of which read, quote, because of their violations of party loyalty to the political committee hereby of party loyalty, the political committee hereby suspends from party membership comrades Robertson, Mage, White, Harper, and Ireland. ... The political committee refers to the plenum of the National Committee the question of further disciplinary action against the Robertson, Mage, White group. End quote. Almost 2 months later, the plenum of the National Committee by 18-1 expelled the 5 suspended members. Shortly after their expulsion, the dissidents issued the first number of their periodical Spartacist, dated February-March 1964, and described as being, quote, published bi-monthly by supporters of the revolutionary tendency expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. In its editorial, the expellees said, quote, we are publishing the Spartacist because our expulsion from the Socialist Workers' Party cuts off our expression of views within that party. We will continue to print a public organ pending a readmission to the Socialist Workers' Party and resumption of our proper role within it. End quote. The paper contained several documents relative to the split. The expelled Socialist Workers Partiers sought to appeal their expulsion to the United Secretariat, which under the principle of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, should, they felt, have the right to reverse the action of the Socialist Workers Party. They sent a letter dated February 23, 1964 to Pierre Franck of the United Secretariat Executive Committee. This letter said that, quote, having exhausted all presently available recourse within the American Party, we are now writing to formally request that the United Secretariat express its opinion on behalf of the restoration of our organizational rights in what is politically your American section, end quote. Pierre Franck replied on April 17th, sending a copy of a resolution of the United Secretariat, which, after a long introduction, said that, quote, the United Secretariat, 1, holds that the so-called, quote, appeal, end quote, by leaders of the Robertson Group is a mere publicity move that seeks to advance hostile factional aims. 2, condemns the course taken by the Robertson Group, particularly its unrestrained public attacks against the Socialist Workers' Party, as injurious to the interest of the world Trotskyist movement, end quote. That was not quite the end of the matter. On May 18, 1965, Harry Turner, writing, quote, for the Spartacist Residential Editorial Board, end quote, sent a letter to the United Secretariat Executive Committee asking that the Spartacist group be permitted to appear before the World Congress of the United Secretariat, which was to meet in June, to present its appeal from expulsion. In reply, Pierre Franck, on behalf of the United Secretariat Executive Committee, said that, quote, we call your attention first of all to the fact that the Fourth International has no organizational connection with the Socialist Workers' Party and consequently has no jurisdiction in a problem such as you raise. Namely, the application of democratic centralism as it affects the organization either as a whole or in individual instances, end quote. This consideration, of course, had not prevented the United Secretariat from taking its earlier action in April 1964. Meanwhile, the Spartacist group had been in touch with Jerry Healy and the International Committee. After the Socialist Workers' Party expulsion of the Tim Woolforth group, Jerry Healy first took the position that the two factions which had been thrown out of the Socialist Workers' Party should unite to form a single affiliate of the International Committee. However, when representatives of both the Spartacist group and the American Committee for the Fourth International, ACFI, had a meeting in Montreal with Jerry Healy and other representatives of the International Committee, it was agreed that both American groups would be regarded as being associated with the International Committee. I believe the International Committee, I'm trying to remember what I've read previously, but I believe the International Committee, there's a split in the 50s between that resulted in kind of like two different Trotskyist organizations out of the initial Fourth International, the one being the International Secretariat and the other being the International Committee. There was a reunification in the early 1960s of these two groups, but I believe that the International Committee, that there was controversy within that, and part of the International Committee continued to exist separately from the reunified Fourth International. And I believe that's what's being discussed here when it says International Committee in London. I'm not absolutely positive. You should ask someone who knows more about the history of Trotskyism than I do, if I'm talking on my ass or not, or re-listen to those videos, which should be up on the channel by the time this one goes up. But yeah. Alright, let's boogie. In conformity with that agreement, both the ACFI and the Spartacists were represented at the April 1966 Third Conference of the International Committee in London. At that meeting, James Robertson delivered a statement on behalf of the Spartacist delegation, which conflicted on several points with the position of the Socialist Labor League and its major figure, Jerry Healy. Robertson first devoted his attention to Pabloism, saying that Pabloism had begun, quote, in 1943 following the failure of Trotsky's perspective of the breakup of the Soviet bureaucracy and of new October revolutions in the aftermath of the war. This failure resulted from the inability to forge revolutionary parties, ... end quote. Robertson agreed with a French delegate who said that, quote, there is no family of Trotskyism, end quote. Quote, nevertheless, end quote, Robertson added, quote, there are now 4 organized international currents all claiming to be Trotskyist and spoken of as, quote, Trotskyist, end quote, in some conventional sense. This state of affairs must be resolved through splits and fusions, end quote. Robertson concluded that it was necessary, quote, to consummate the struggle for the actual reconstruction of the Fourth International, culminating in a World Congress to refound it, end quote. Robertson also discussed the emergence of regimes such as those in China and Castro's Cuba, arguing that in these revolutionary movements the peasantry had, quote, an exceptionally independent role, end quote, resulting in, quote, a social transformation led by the petty bourgeoisie, ... end quote. The result of this, he argued, was that, quote, all that has come out of China and Cuba was a state of the same order as that issuing out of the political counter-revolution of Stalin in the Soviet Union, ... That is why we are led to define states such as these as deformed workers' states, ... end quote. In this discussion, Robertson was critical of some of the formulations of the British and French affiliates of the International Committee. Jerry Healy and the leadership of the SLL, which I believe is Socialist Labor League, clearly disagreed with some of Robertson's basic formulations. As a consequence, the Spartacists were finally eliminated from the London Conference and consequently from the International Committee. The excuse for this was alleged, quote, insubordination, end quote, by Robertson and the Spartacist delegation. 5 months after the London Conference, the Spartacist group formally established the Spartacist League. It elected a central committee chaired by Robertson and adopted a declaration of principles. That document started by saying, quote, the Spartacist League of the United States is a revolutionary organization which is part of the international revolutionary movement, is committed to the task of building the party which will lead the working class to the victory of the socialist revolution in the United States, end quote. It declared the League to be the inheritor of the traditions of, quote, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and Liebknecht, end quote, and of, quote, Marxism as developed in theory and practice by V.I. Lenin and L.D. Trotsky as embodied in the decisions of the first 4 Congresses of the Communist International and by the Transitional Program and other documents adopted by the 1938 Founding Conference of the Fourth International, end quote. It was, quote, the continuator of the revolutionary heritage of the early Communist Party and the Socialist Workers Party, end quote. The declaration said that, quote, we stand with all these groups seeking the rebirth of the Fourth International and as a first step the creation of a bona fide international committee of revolutionary Trotskyists based on a real and living democratic centralism, end quote. It adopted the more or less orthodox Trotskyist position that the USSR was a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, and other Communist Party-controlled ones were, quote, deformed workers' states, end quote. The declaration claimed that, quote, within the Trotskyist movement, the problems posed by the post-1943 Stalinist expansion have given rise to the revisionist current of Pabloism, ... characterized chiefly by a renunciation of the necessity for revolutionary leadership and an adaptation to existing petty bourgeois and Stalinist leaderships. I'm not exactly sure, but I believe critics of Pablo and the trajectory of the Fourth International in terms of its new form of entryism. I think they call the word that they use, I'm not sure, is liquidationist, which means like what is basically said here, renunciation of necessity for revolutionary leadership and adaptation to existing petty bourgeois and Stalinist leaderships. Basically, Trotskyists should be a faction within larger Stalinist or socialist parties, and not an independent vanguard party of its own. I believe is what the critique of Pavlovism is kind of oriented around, but I'm not exactly sure. This deterioration of theory has led to the degeneration of the Fourth International founded by Leon Trotsky and to its organizational breakup. The Spartacist League, by contributing to the theoretical clarification of the Marxist movement and to the reforging of the workers' necessary organizational weapons, upholds the revolutionary proletarian principles of Marxism and will carry them forward to the vanguard of the working class. End quote. Evolution of the Spartacist League. The Spartacist League remained for many years an organization of young people, most of them middle class and college educated or still in college. It was a small group estimated by Harry Turner in 1969 to have about 100 members. The Spartacist League was largely isolated from the rest of the radical movement in the United States, and after the International Committee's conference in 1966, the Spartacist League was without counterparts in other countries. The Spartacist League's periodical, Spartacist, came out sporadically, 10 months passing in 1969 to 68 between the appearance of the 10th and 11th number, although it was supposed to be bi-monthly. A resolution adopted at the 1979 conference of the Spartacist Youth Organization noted that, quote, from the time of the founding conference of the Socialist League in 1966, the organization was involved in little mass work of any kind. The main arena for mass work in the early days of the Spartacist tendency was the civil rights movement, but with the rise of black nationalism, we were effectively frozen out of the black movement by 1968, end quote. It's important to note that probably in relation to this, that the Socialist Workers Party at this time very much embraced black nationalism and emphasized the supposedly close relationship between the Socialist Workers Party and Malcolm X in the final years of his life, with Malcolm X ostensibly behind closed doors supporting the candidate of the Socialist Workers Party, I believe for president. Can't remember his first name, but the last name is DeBerry, which was a black American Trotskyist. In spite of the youthfulness of most of the Spartacists, they did not have a significant influence in the growing left-wing student movement of the mid-1960s. The cited resolution noted that the only Spartacist student organization was the Young Socialist League at Cornell. It, quote, campaigned in support of civil rights and black self-defense, collecting money for the deacons for defense under the slogan, "Every dime buys a bullet." ... The Young Socialist League at Cornell shocked and polarized the entire campus by collecting funds for the NLF, making concrete our call for, quote, military victory to the NLF, end quote, end quote. In its early years, the Spartacist League was very largely dominated by James Robertson. Harry Turner, a severe critic of Robertson, described his leading role. Harry Turner noted that, quote, James Robertson has played a key and pivotal role in the formation and continued operation of the Spartacist movement. Robertson has until recently been the only person in its ranks willing and able to assume the responsibility of being a full-time functionary. He has shown himself to be an articulate, audacious leader, able to deal incisively with many questions arising in the anti-war student electoral and certain trade union arenas in which the non-specializing college graduate predominates. Robertson has demonstrated the capacity to take into account the many-sided aspects of a situation and simultaneously deal with several political and organizational questions in depth and with flexibility and tactical application, end quote. In 1967 to 68, the first important internal struggle in the history of the Spartacist League developed. It was basically over the determination of the majority led by James Robertson to keep the organization oriented principally toward the student movement and the desire of the opposition element, led mainly by Harry Turner, to turn the League toward the labor movement, particularly in the direction of trying to work among Black and Hispanic trade unionists. In September 1967, the Political Bureau of the League had unanimously adopted a memorandum on the Negro struggle submitted by Turner, providing for the League to form an organization to stimulate establishment of union rank-and-file caucuses, particularly among minority workers, to fight both union leaders and employers. In pursuance of this, a, quote, pan-union militant labor civil rights committee, MLCRC, end quote, was organized in New York by the Spartacist League local there. In the following year, Robertson pushed a motion through a membership meeting of the New York local to dissolve the Militant Labor Civil Rights Committee and to try to organize instead caucuses in different unions. It was over this issue that the factional fight developed, although broader philosophical issues also came to be discussed. During part of this controversy, Turner and his supporters were allied with people who were attracted by the French Voix ouvrière group's technique of propagandizing among factory workers. However, before the struggle had been completed, those people left the organization to establish their own group. By the end of 1968, Turner, Harry Turner, and his principal associates had been driven out of the Spartacist League. As a consequence of this factional struggle, which took up much of the leaders' time and energy, the Spartacists did not get deeply involved in the radicalization of the students, which was underway at the time. Thus, they did not participate in the struggle in the Students for a Democratic Society between the very far left and anti-union Weatherman faction and the labor-oriented group led principally by the Maoist Progressive Labor Party. However, in 1969, the Spartacists did attempt to participate in the SDS conflict. The Spartacists sided with the Progressive Labor Party faction at the SDS convention, where the organization split. Early in 1970, they established the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus. And the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus, quote, functioned both as a caucus within the Students for a Democratic Society and a loose Trotskyist youth group, end quote. The Spartacist League also sought to use the Revolutionary Marxist Caucus as its principal instrument in the movement against the Vietnam War. The 1979 Socialist Youth League, I believe that's the name, with SYL, which I believe is Socialist Youth League resolution, noted that, quote, the Spartacist League, maybe it's the Spartacist Youth League. Anyway, quote, the Spartacist League / Revolutionary Marxist Caucus sought to create a class polarization in the U.S. around the Vietnam War, The Revolutionary Marxist Caucus fought for a working-class orientation for labor political strikes against the war, End quote. This participation in the Students for a Democratic Society conflict and the anti-war movement paid dividends for the Spartacist League. Between 1970 and 1972, its membership increased 3 times over. The Spartacist League's youth group, which in 1971 was renamed the Revolutionary Communist Youth, quote, grew fourfold in 1971 to 72, end quote. In 1971, the Spartacist League adopted a, quote, memorandum on the transformation of the Spartacist League, end quote, which defined the Spartacist League as a propagandist organization preparing the ground for establishment of a revolutionary party. The Spartacist League also provided for reorganization of the group's work on the basis of special, quote, commissions, end quote, dealing with labor, women, and youth. Thereafter, much of the Spartacist League's effort was concentrated on publishing and circulating its periodicals. The Spartacist League itself began to issue Workers' Vanguard, a weekly paper, on a regular basis. The Spartacist League's youth group, which in 1973 changed its name again to Spartacus Youth Group, put out a monthly Young Spartacus, and the Women's Commission of the Spartacist League began to publish a quarterly Women in Revolution. A typical copy of this last periodical carried articles on, quote, feminism versus Marxism, origins of the conflict, end quote, recounting the troubles of Victoria Woodhull with the First International in the 1870s, the struggle of Spartacists within the, quote, socialist feminist, end quote, Berkeley/Oakland Women's Union, and an attack on, quote, third worldism, end quote. In 1971, the Spartacist League leadership ordered the, quote, industrialization, end quote, of the League. That is, the Spartacist League members got jobs in industry, affiliate with their appropriate unions, and seek to win a labor base for the organization. This maneuver caused certain problems for the organization, and particularly its youth group. As the Spartacus Youth League, let me make sure I'm saying that's the name right. Okay. As the Spartacus Youth League resolution of 1979 comments, quote, while the revolutionary communist youth was successful in establishing campus fractions on a number of major college campuses, the recruitment that resulted did not compensate for the loss of a number of our most talented and mature youth activists to trade union implantation and other party responsibilities, end quote. There is no evidence that the Spartacists won appreciable influence in any union. After the gains which the Spartacist League and the Spartacist League's youth affiliate made during the 1970s, the membership of the two groups leveled off or even declined in subsequent years. The Spartacus Youth League 1979 resolution already cited noted that, quote, though the party has continued to recruit both from the Socialist Youth League, the Spartacus Youth League, and elsewhere, the membership of the Spartacus Youth League has declined each year since 1975. The effects on the party have been evident. The youth recruited to our movement, mainly off the campuses, have been attracted largely on the basis of abstract ideas rather than through actual social struggle, and consequently are particularly vulnerable to the pressures of bourgeois society, end quote. In 1979, the Spartacus Youth League suffered a significant split. A number of the Spartacus Youth League's principal leaders, including those associated with editing its periodical Young Spartacus, were expelled on the grounds of excessive, quote, intellectualism, end quote, and of not being sufficiently subordinate to Spartacist League control. Virtually since its inception, the Spartacist League was principally active in trying to recruit people from other radical groups. Indeed, leaders of other groups tended to regard that as being one of the principal characteristics of the Spartacists. They became inveterate distributors of leaflets and sellers of their own literature at the meetings organized by other groups. The Spartacists' frequent heckling of speakers at such meetings sometimes brought about efforts to ban Spartacists from the sessions. Sometimes the Spartacist League published evidence of its success in recruiting from other radical groups. Thus, in the report of its Fourth National Conference in 1974, it was recounted that among those participating were, quote, 26 former members of the Socialist Workers Party Young Socialist Alliance, 15 of PL/WSA, 11 of the International Socialists, as well as lesser numbers from numerous other organizations, including the Weathermen, Black Panthers, RU, SP/Young YPSL, and CP, end quote. In the late 1970s, the Spartacists began to run occasional candidates in general elections. In 1978, the Spartacists named Marjorie Stamberg as candidate for the New York State Assembly from the 64th District, Greenwich Village. Marjorie Stamberg was reported to have gotten 909 votes, or 3.3% of the total, and to have done better than the Socialist Workers Party and Communist Party nominees. In 1981, the Spartacists ran Don Andrews, a black member of the Spartacist League Central Committee, and Ann Weekly, quote, a supporter of the Spartacist League, end quote, for the Detroit City Council. In 1983, they put up Martha Phillips as nominee for City Council member at large in Oakland. In the late 1970s, too, the Spartacist League began to organize meetings against the KKK and other far-right groups. The Spartacist League were particularly pleased with a demonstration they organized in November 1982 at the foot of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., attended by a reported 5,000 people, which had the endorsement of a number of Union locals and resulted in the Klan's decision to abandon a plan for a march down the Mall. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Spartacist League adopted a number of positions on international issues which differentiated the Spartacist League more or less drastically from other groups in the United States which claimed more or less loyalty to Trotskyism. Three of these were particularly worthy of note: Iran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the Solidarity movement in Poland. These are the predictions that I made about the Spartacist, or not the predictions, but from my knowledge, the Spartacist League were anti-solidarity and pro-Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I don't know what their position on Iran was, but I'm going to guess by the reactionary positions of the first two that I'm not very much expecting good things. But maybe I'm wrong. Unlike most of the far left in the United States, the Spartacists did not greet with unalloyed enthusiasm the fall of the Shah and the rise to power of the Ayatollah Khomeini. All right. While the struggle against the Shah was still underway, they raised the slogan, "Down with the Shah, down with the mullahs." After the triumph of Khomeini, they continued to denounce the theocratic dictatorship and to be particularly critical of other Trotskyist groups which were giving support, however, quote, critical, end quote, to the Khomeini regime. That's the problem with national self-determination, especially when national self-determination becomes the principal good of, or the primary contradiction, or any of the other things that different reactionary left groups have to say about national self-determination, is that self-determination of a nation, that rather abstract concept, has nothing to do with the actual self-determination, or at least extremely limited to do with the self-determination of human beings living within that nation state. So people champion the national self-determination, the sovereignty of, for example, North Korea, as if that has anything substantial to do with the self-determination of the working population or any of the population within those countries. And the same is true for Iran. I think from the perspective of feminism and from the perspective of a consistent, emphatic rejection of anti-Semitism, the rejection, the so-called the national self-determination of Iran has completely failed on the score of substantial self-determination, and to make the continued national self-determination of the nation as as in some way compatible with the self-determination of a people, or in some way necessarily preconditional, or necessarily leading to human self-determination, not the self-determination of nations and states, which getting to grips on what a nation and a state and what an ethnic group is, or what are the basis for a nation existing, um, has nothing substantial to do with human emancipation. And I think the course of the 20th century has provided ample examples of how national liberation, or mere separation, ostensible separation from the imperialist world system, has substantially meant nothing for how everyday life is experienced for working people across the globe. Um, and I think uh, especially in cases of Iran, where what is backing it is not Marxism, Leninism, even, but theocratic, anti-Semitic Islamism, thoroughly demonstrates the very extreme limitations of national self-determination and anti-imperialism as the principal goals of, or the preconditional goals for radical left projects. Um, that's just me ranting, but um, knowing anything about the history of the Iranian Revolution, and I'm not an expert of it, um, uh, but when people have positive things to say about the Khomeini regime, the Islamic Republic of Iran, fucking pisses me off. Um, Especially when there was like a joint meeting between different so-called anti-imperialist groups, including the group Code Pink, with the leader of Iran in, I believe, in the early 2000s, of Ahmadinejad, about anti-imperialism. Uh, I think that's fucking disgusting, but that's just personal opinion. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you like theocratic, anti-feminist, anti-Semitic dictatorships, but I don't. And I don't have such a strongly warm estimation of national self-determination to justify those things, because they're because the Iran is ostensibly anti-imperialist. Anyway. Also, in contrast to most of the rest of the far left in the United States and elsewhere, the Spartacists enthusiastically supported the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Workers' Vanguard, in one of the early issues following the Soviet move, had the headline, quote, "Hail Red Army," end quote, with the subtitle, quote, "While Carter stews, Soviet Army rolls back Afghan mullahs," end quote. And that's a kind of a complicated thing to talk about there. I'm not an expert in Afghanistan, but like, for example, like Reagan, fucking arming fucking jihadists in a proxy war with the Soviet Union. Um, I don't particularly support the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at all, but I don't really have I have a very negative estimation of the people they were ostensibly in conflict with, which would be the fucking jihadist, what are they called? Mujahideen, that were fighting I believe it was a coup of some kind by the Communist Party of Afghanistan, that was being attacked by the Mujahideen, that were eventually getting weapons from the United States. Yeah, but I'm not an expert on it. But when like people talk about how, like, just how people talk about how, well, like every negative thing that Hamas does is basically attributed to Israel. It's like, well, Israel made it this way. It's kind of the same thing that people say about the United States when it comes to groups like to jihadist groups such as Al Qaeda or the Taliban. They say, oh, well, those groups are only attacking America. Like, we shouldn't really be too critical of them attacking America or something like that. on the grounds that, it was really Reagan who's at fault here for arming them to begin with to fight the Soviets. As if there was absolutely no agency whatsoever for people to not choose jihadism as their response to social catastrophe. But another ranting of mine. Workers' Vanguard, in one of the early issues following the Soviet move, had hailed the headline, quote, "Hail Red Army," end quote, with the subtitle, quote, "While Carter stews, Soviet Army rolls back Afghan mullahs," end quote. The accompanying article proclaimed that, quote, "From a military point of view, the Soviet intervention may or may not have been wise, though certainly it is deeply just to oppose the Islamic reactionary insurgents backed by imperialism," which they were. There can be no question that for revolutionaries, our side in this conflict is with the Red Army. I don't know. Maybe it's just a tragedy. In fact, although it is surely uncalled for militarily, a natural response on the part of the world's young leftists would be an enthusiastic desire to join an international brigade to Afghanistan to fight the CIA-connected mullahs, ... end quote. Finally, unlike virtually all of the far left except the U.S. Communist Party, the Spartacists were strongly opposed to the rise of solidarity in Poland. Their position was well synthesized in the title of a pamphlet the Spartacist League issued in October 1981, Solidarność, Polish Company Union for CIA and Bankers. The pamphlet consisted principally of reprints of articles from Workers' Vanguard during the months following the Gdansk strike of August 1980, denouncing various Solidarity leaders and the intellectual advisors of the new Polish labor movement. The Spartacist League does not normally publish its membership figures. However, in 1980, Joseph Schwartz of the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee estimated that the Spartacists had about 300 members. Offshoots of the Spartacist League. The Revolutionary Workers' League. Subsequent to the split of Harry Turner and his associates in 1968, the Spartacist League suffered two other small splits. One of these took place in late 1970. The Revolutionary Workers' League was founded in 1976 by two ex-members of the Spartacist League, Peter Sollenberger and Leland Sanderson, former Harvard graduate students who had moved to the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. There they sought to organize a union of clerical workers employed by the university. They also became involved with the gay and lesbian rights groups at the university. They issued a periodical, Revolutionary Worker. With the formation of the Trotskyist International Liaison Committee, TILC, under the sponsorship of the Workers' Socialist League of Great Britain, led by the ex-Auto Workers Union leader Alan Thornett, the Revolutionary Workers League became its U.S. affiliate. I believe Alan Thornett wrote a book that I have on my shelf from, it's about, I think it's titled like Revolutionary Marxism in Spain, which is about, I guess, the POUM and the Bolshevik Leninists in the Spanish Civil War. Two side notes on that. Of course, George Orwell fought in a POUM militia. The POUM being a unification of right oppositionist dissidents and left oppositionist dissidents. And we should definitely always keep, the words left and right, put them in quotation marks when discussing those groups within 1920s and early 1930s Soviet Union. I guess 1920s is actually more accurate. But that was the group that George Orwell fought in, the POUM, the Party of Marxist Unification, the unification of Trotskyists and right oppositionists, which is why the POUM's often kind of like falsely attributed as being, strictly speaking, a Trotskyist organization. And then the strictly Trotskyist group was the Bolshevik Leninists, um, led uh, headed by Grandizo Muniz. And if you know Grandizo Muniz eventually moved to Mexico and was good friends with Natalia Sadova Trotsky, Trotsky's wife, and they signed a joint resignation from the Fourth International on the grounds that the Fourth International was dogmatically continuing to adhere to the degenerated worker state thesis, which they viewed no longer held, without embracing Shachtman's bureaucratic collectivism thesis, but jumping right to the state capitalist thesis about the social nature of the Soviet Union. So, yeah, Alan Thornett's book, I suppose, is about that, and it would be very interesting to read. But it's probably one of those things where I bought the book because it was on sale, and now I have a million goddamn books on my shelf that I haven't read because I'm greedy. Anyway, no one cares about that. After a crisis in the TILC, the Trotskyist International Liaison Committee, over the Falklands Malvinas War of 1983, the Revolutionary Workers' League continued its affiliation. In 1981, the Revolutionary Workers' League merged with another small group, the Socialist League Democratic Centralists, SLDC, consisting of ex-followers of Tim Wohlforth before Wohlforth's expulsion from the Workers' League. Headed by Steve Bryant, it had its principal center in the San Francisco area. After the merger of these groups under the name of the Revolutionary Workers' League, that organization began to publish a new periodical, Worker Struggle. The organization strongly supported the Polish Solidarity. It also sought to work with anti-administration forces within the United Auto Workers in the Detroit area. Thus, in November 1982, the Revolutionary Workers' League supported that so-called United Front Caucus in Local 600 at the River Rouge plant. That ticket received about 10% of the vote. There is no indication of how many members, if any, the Revolutionary Workers' League may have had in Local 600. In 1982, Leon Perez of the Internationalist Workers Party, Fourth International, credited the Revolutionary Workers League with about 40 members. By 1984, the Revolutionary Workers League was in discussion with the Internationalist Workers Party, Fourth International. Within the Peace and Freedom Party of California, the legally recognized, quote, socialist, end quote, party in the state, members of the two groups worked together at the PFP, the Peace and Freedom Party's August 1984 convention against the majority element more or less dominated by the Communist Party. In October 1982, the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, had proposed negotiations with the Revolutionary Workers' League for possible general cooperation between the two groups. Although the Revolutionary Workers' League did participate in an emergency national Trotskyist conference organized by the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International, in 1983, nothing further came of negotiations between the two groups at that time. However, the Internationalist Workers' Party, Fourth International periodical, reported in August 1984 that, quote, a debate has begun between the two organizations about the need to build a single revolutionary Marxist Trotskyist organization in the United States, end quote. The Revolutionary Workers' League, which apparently was by then no longer affiliated with the Trotskyist International Liaison Committee, accepted a suggestion that it send a delegate to the Morenoist Internationalist Workers' League's forthcoming World Congress. The external tendency, ET. The other schism in the Spartacist League was that of the so-called external tendency, ET. It was officially proclaimed in October 1982 when a, quote, declaration of an external tendency of the IST, end quote, was issued. The exact nature of the issues between the external tendency and the Spartacist League remains somewhat obscure, at least to an outsider. The October 1982 declaration claimed that, quote, while the SL's program remains revolutionary, the Spartacist League's leadership collective increasingly exhibits hypercentralist, paranoid, and personalist characteristics. These tendencies on the part of the leaders have reached a point where they call into question both the possibility of significantly enlarging the organization and of reproducing Trotskyist cadres within it, end quote. In addition to this familiar, quote, organizational, end quote, complaint, the external tendency appears to have had differences with the Spartacist League leadership over its attitudes towards the Soviet Union, trade union tactics, the U.S. intervention in Lebanon in 1982, and several other issues. There were counterparts to the external tendency of the United States and Germany and Canada. The Morenoist periodical Working Class Opposition claimed in July 1985 that the Spartacist League had lost about half its membership and cadres since 1982 as the result of the external tendencies, defection, and other internal conflicts. Okay, I'm going to stop here for today. The Workers' League. Early development. The second group to emerge from the 1963 to 64 split in the Socialist Workers Party was that which came to be called the Workers' League. It originated as a division within the revolutionary tendency which had challenged the Dobbs-Hanson leadership's position on the Cuban Revolution, the, quote, reunification, end quote, of the Fourth International and other issues. From its inception, the group which was to form the Workers' League proclaimed its adherence to the line advocated by the British Socialist Labour League led by Jerry Healey. In the document dated November 13, 1962, announcing its separation from the majority of the revolutionary tendency led by James Robertson and others, the group made this clear. They started their, quote, call for the reorganization of the minority tendency, end quote, by stating that, quote, the tendency expresses its general political agreement with the tendency of the International Committee, which is agreement around the 1961 International Perspectives Resolution presented by the Socialist Labour League, end quote. This, quote, call, end quote, stated the differences of the group led by Woolforth and included, among others, Albert Phillips and Fred Mazelis, Mazelis, with the revolutionary tendency leadership headed by Robertson. For one thing, they opposed the characterization of the Socialist Workers' Party as a whole as being, quote, centrist, end quote, commenting that, quote, to characterize the Socialist Workers' Party majority as a finished centrist tendency is to give up the political battle before the political battle has begun, end quote. The document stressed that, quote, the tendency must recognize that the Socialist Workers' Party is the main instrument for the realization of socialism in the U.S. Our comrades must therefore work as loyal party members and accepting the administrative decisions of the leadership even though we might be very much against them, end quote. At the time of this, quote, call, end quote, Woolforth, who was a member of the political bureau of the Socialist Workers' Party, wrote a fellow party member in San Francisco that, quote, let there be no doubt about it, we do not want a split internationally or domestically, end quote. When in fact the Robertson group were expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party in December 1963, quote, the Woolforth-Phillips grouping, end quote, opposed the move. At the Socialist Workers' Party convention of July 1983, at which unification with the, quote, Pabloites, end quote, to form the United Secretariat of the Fourth International was agreed upon, Woolforth was removed as member of the political committee. In preparation for that convention, the reorganized minority tendency, as the Woolforth Group called itself, had submitted a draft resolution in which it made, quote, proposals that the Socialist Workers Party make work in the trade unions among the workers who were beginning to move into struggle not only against their employers but also against their trade union bureaucrats, and to win black and Spanish-speaking workers on this basis, end quote. In developing its position, the revolutionary Marxist tendency, the reorganized I'm fucking just guessing names now, Jesus Christ. Reorganized minority tendency had worked closely with Jerry Healy and the International Committee of the Fourth International. In fact, in refusing to condemn the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership as being, quote, centrist, end quote, Woolforth had been following instructions from Healy, instructions to which the Robertson Group refused to adhere. Attempts of the Woolforth Group to continue the struggle within the Socialist Workers' Party proved fruitless. A few months after the expulsion of the Robertson faction, Woolforth and his followers were also expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party. The particular issue over which this action came was a controversy over the entry of the Ceylonese Trotskyist party, the Lanka Sama Samaja, into the government of Mrs. Bandaranaike. The Woolforth Group immediately formed the American Committee for the Fourth International, ACFI, and began to publish a mimeographed periodical, Bulletin of International Socialism, later shortened to Bulletin. During its early years, the Woolforth Group, which in 1966 became the Workers' League, defined its position on a number of issues on which it was clearly separated from the stands of the Socialist Workers' Party. These questions included the Soviet-Chinese feud, the Vietnam War, the race issue in the United States, and the formation of a labor party. In an early issue of the Bulletin, the ACFI stated its position on the Sino-Soviet controversy. It asked, quote, what position should revolutionaries take on the Sino-Soviet dispute? Revolutionaries must realize that the major internal threat to the workers' state and to the whole proletarian struggle comes at the present time from the Kremlin and those to the right of the Kremlin in Eastern Europe, Thus, we cannot stand aside in this great dispute between the USSR leadership and the CCP and say, quote, a plague on both your houses, end quote. The major threat both to the defense of the workers' states and to the future development of the whole world revolution comes at the present time from the Khrushchevists. The Chinese, on the other hand, have been forced to make some searching criticisms of Khrushchevism, criticisms which were known as well as are also of Stalinism itself, even though the Chinese cannot face up to this. At the same time, we have no illusions about the Chinese. End quote. Some years later, with the outbreak of the Great Cultural Revolution in China, the Workers' League gave that movement at least qualified backing. Thus, a throwaway for a meeting on, quote, hands off the Chinese Revolution, end quote, proclaimed, quote, conditional support of, quote, Red Guards, end quote, the duty of every revolutionist, end quote. At the same time, the Bulletin reprinted an editorial from its British counterpart written by Mike Banda, which made the same argument. The ACFI Workers' League took a distinctly different attitude towards the Vietnam War from that of the Socialist Workers' Party. Unlike the Socialist Workers' Party concentration of its anti-war efforts on building as wide a coalition as possible in favor of getting the United States out of the war, the ACFI strongly supported Viet Cong victory in the conflict. As early as April 1965, the Bulletin endorsed Jerry Healy's proclamation that, quote, we are not talking about peace, we are talking about participating in class war. We hope the Viet Cong will hammer the daylights out of the Americans. We are for the defeat of the Americans, end quote. The ACFI Workers' League also strongly rejected the Socialist Workers Party line of rapprochement with black nationalists in the United States. Their position was summed up in the comments that, quote, what Negro militants have to understand is that the problem they face is essentially a class problem, and that the problem is directly related to the problems of poor white workers, end quote. This same statement noted that, quote, the only way to build the forces amongst the Negro population, is on the basis of a program that corresponds to the needs of the vast majority of the population. This program must, in addition, be tied to a program of independent working class political action, end quote. From its inception as an independent organization, the Woolworth Group evidenced its hope to develop influence within the trade union movement. With the 7th issue of its periodical, it launched a regular feature, quote, Labor Scope, end quote, which provided information and support for the struggles of various unions. The Workers' League strongly urged the formation of a labor party. Lucy St. John, then editor of Bulletin, wrote early in 1968 that, quote, the next great leap of the American working class will be the creation of its own party, Such a party cannot be content to wrest reforms from capitalists at a time when the capitalists must wrest gains from the workers or the system will go under. Thus, of necessity, the creation of such a party must be seen as a struggle against not only the capitalists but also the labor bureaucracy, and a struggle for not simply reforms but transitional demands, which pose the necessity of the workers running the government themselves and in their own interest, wiping out the capitalist system to achieve their own needs, end quote. The Workers' League formed a group to carry on agitation for a labor party, the Trade Union Alliance for a Labor Party, TUALP. Much of the propaganda work of the League for some time was conducted in the name of TUALP rather than of the Workers' League itself. This tactic was criticized by their British comrades of the Socialist Labour League, and subsequently Woolworth admitted that the British had been right in labeling it, quote, liquidationist, end quote. In spite of its orientation toward the more Trotskyist emphasis on trying to appeal to the organized workers at a time when the Socialist Workers' Party was seeking primarily to gain followers in the predominantly middle-class anti-war movement and New Left and among black nationalist, women's liberationist, and gays, the Workers' League had only limited success. They achieved an appreciable trade union influence even on a local level, and the League clearly remained an organization of aging middle-class youth. Much of the attention of the Workers' League was centered on publishing and selling its newspaper, The Bulletin. In November 1969, the paper, which was by then being printed rather than mimeographed, became a weekly. Lucy St. John, the paper's editor, proclaimed in the first issue of the weekly paper that, quote, this is indeed the epoch of Trotskyism and the construction of mass revolutionary parties as part of an international movement. This is the meaning of the first daily Trotskyist paper published by our British comrades. The publication of the weekly bulletin is the first step toward the building of a mass party of the working class in the United States, end quote. The League was ultimately able to buy its own web offset press and to issue the paper twice a week. The League centered much of its attention on other far-left elements. It polemicized frequently with the Spartacists. In its first year or so, its periodical carried considerable material on the Progressive Labor Party, apparently with some hope of winning that group away from Maoism and toward Trotskyism. In 1969, Bulletin carried a series of articles by Tom Woolworth, calling on members of the Socialist Workers' Party to look into their party's history to find the reasons for its succumbing to, quote, Pabloism, end quote. And in 1970, the paper proposed to other Trotskyist groups a joint commemoration of the Lenin centennial, and to the Socialist Workers' Party that they have a joint Trotsky memorial meeting. Neither invitation was accepted. Leaders of the Workers' League considered that one of their strong points as a Trotskyist organization was their international affiliation. At the first conference of the International Committee of the Fourth International in London in April 1966, the Workers' League, rather than the Spartacist, was accepted as the United States affiliate of that body. Thereafter, the Workers' League frequently emphasized in its propaganda that it was a member of the only, quote, real, end quote, Fourth International. When the International Committee split in 1971, the Workers' League continued to be affiliated with that faction led by Jerry Healey of the Socialist Labor League of Great Britain. In 1974, the Workers' League for the first time attempted to carry out electoral activity. It organized a, quote, Workers' Party, end quote, slate in the election for Congress in 2 districts in New York City, naming Helen Halyard and Terry Delgado as its candidates in the 14th and 12th districts, the latter running against the Representative Shirley Chisholm in Brooklyn. Shirley Chisholm, as you all know, eventually ran for president. First black woman to do so, I believe. Undoubtedly, the high point of Workers' League activity and influence was in the very early 1970s. In 1970, the group was able to hold 2 more or less successful regional conferences, one in the East, one in the West. At the Western meeting in San Francisco, more than 70 people attended. At the end of 1971, the Workers' League was for the first time able to launch its own youth organization, the Young Socialists. At least two previous attempts had failed. Among those who addressed the founding conference of this organization were Tim Woolforth and the editor of the bulletin, Lucy St. John. The group's second conference was held in December 1973 with 350 people said to have been in attendance. Young Socialist, the youth group's periodical, was particularly directed to young workers, and among its features are for about a year, was a 2-page centerfold recounting, quote, heroes of the American labor movement, end quote. The Workers' League, Jerry Healey, and the International Committee. New section. That coffee's fine. Within a year after the League's youth affiliate was established, the Workers' League had entered into a serious crisis. The crisis resulted in most of those who have founded Workers' League and led Workers' League during Workers' League's first decade leaving the organization, and began a long-term decline in the Workers' League. There were probably several causes for the crisis. Some of the rival Trotskyist groups felt that in the League's drive to issue and distribute a semi-weekly paper, it had, quote, worked its people to death, end quote, ultimately generating disaffection. Undoubtedly, there were strong differences among the leadership on a number of issues, particularly the effort to use the Young Socialist as a vehicle for winning influence for the Workers' League among organized workers. Finally, the increasingly bizarre attitudes and behavior of Jerry Healey, the head of the International Committee with which the Workers' League was affiliated, as well as his direct interference in the internal affairs of the Workers' League, was a major factor in the crisis and decline of the Workers' League. For about a year in 1973 and 1974, a factional struggle was waged within the Workers' League. On the one side was Tim Woolforth and those supporting him, and on the other a group led by Lucy St. John and Dennis O'Casey. As a consequence, the Workers' League was said by the Spartacists to have lost about 150 members, including, quote, most of the Central Workers' League leadership, and ... Many of the more able youth the Workers' League had managed to recruit over the past period, ... end quote. Although Tim Wohlforth survived this struggle as the leader of the National Secretary of the Workers' League, Tim Wohlforth was suddenly ousted from his position in August 1974 and subsequently resigned from the organization as a result of Healy's direct intervention. This was by no means the first time that Healy had personally participated in the affairs of the Workers' League. Subsequent to his ouster from the Workers' League, Wohlforth recounted that early in 1973, Jerry Healy had attended a, quote, critically important National Committee plenum of the Workers' League, end quote. Wohlforth added that, quote, the main thrust of Comrade Jerry Healy's intervention at that plenum was to fight for an understanding that the center of the world capitalist crisis was the crisis of American capitalism. If this was grasped, then we could understand the explosive nature of class relations which would develop in the United States simultaneously with revolutionary outbursts in Europe, and ... Comrade Healy stressed the importance of seeing a labor party in this revolutionary context with workers' defense committees, councils of action type organizations being formed in the neighborhoods, ... end quote. In this case, Healy was presenting his American supporters with the official, quote, line, end quote, of the International Committee. In August of the following year, he undertook to go further and change the leadership of the Workers' League. Wohlforth subsequently recounted the details of this incident. A couple of weeks before a scheduled Workers' League summer camp, Tim Wohlforth was summoned to Britain to talk with Jerry Healy. There, Tim Wohlforth was presented by Healy with a series of rumors with which expelled members of the Workers' League had regaled him. Although Wohlforth thought that he had successfully confronted these reports, he was somewhat disconcerted to have been submitted to interrogation about them by Healy and others. The Workers' League summer camp, which Healy and other British leader Cliff Slaughter attended, Healy indicated great preoccupation with, quote, security measures, end quote, to assure his own safety. Then he accused Wohlforth of having, quote, protected, end quote, his close associate Nancy Fields, whom Healy said he suspected of being a CIA agent. Using this as his reason, Healy then proposed to a Workers' League Central Committee meeting held at the summer camp that Wohlforth be removed as National Secretary and be substituted for by Fred Mazellis. Both measures were adopted unanimously, with both Wohlforth and Fields voting in favor. Subsequently, the International Committee was called together to ratify the measures taken at the Workers' League summer camp. Healy's intervention was endorsed. Wohlforth was barred from political leadership of the League, and Nancy Fields from, quote, any contact with the League of any sort, end quote. I feel like I've heard about this Nancy Fields person before. But I'm not sure if I'm not sure what the hell the story was. Thereupon, Wohlforth resigned from the Workers' League. When later Wohlforth was invited to reapply for membership by the International Committee, Wohlforth refused to do so when informed that he would first have to, quote, justify, end quote, himself before the International Committee. Fred Mazellis thereafter remained the principal leader of the Workers' League. However, by the early 1980s, he had been succeeded by David North. David North is like the head honcho at I think the name of the party is the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, but is probably better known as like the leader behind the World Socialist website, which I think is like WS World Socialism website for World Socialism. I don't know. Maybe it's just I don't know what the website is, but yeah. He is still active. Subsequent history of the Workers' League. The Workers' League was still functioning in the middle 1980s. Its principal center of membership was in Michigan, although in 1983 it also had local groups in Minneapolis, Chicago, and New York. After Wohlforth's disappearance from its leadership, the Workers' League shifted headquarters from New York City to Detroit. There it reestablished the Trade Union Alliance for a Labor Party, which it described as the, quote, industrial arm, end quote, of the Workers' League. Although there is no indication that the League or its alliance gained any visible influence among the auto workers or any other organized labor group, the alliance did organize at the end of July 1983 a national conference of workers and unemployed. The call for this conference had as its concluding slogans, quote, Call of Congress of Labor, General Strike Against Reagan, Build a Labor Party, Fight for a Workers' Government, end quote. The Young Socialists, the Workers' League youth group, also continued to be active on some college campuses. In May 1984, it held its 10th national conference in Detroit, which featured a premiere showing of a film titled, quote, The Year of Karl Marx, end quote. The Workers' League continued to argue in favor of establishment of a labor party. It published in 1980 a pamphlet entitled, quote, The Case for a Labor Party, end quote. One of the themes of the League's presidential election campaign in 1984 was, quote, Build a Labor Party, end quote. During the 1984 campaign, the Workers' League named Ed Wynn for President of the United States and Helen Halyard for Vice President. Both nominees were blacks. The party was on the ballot in 6 states: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota. They also ran Fred Mazzelles as candidate for the U.S. Senate in Michigan. Wynn was officially credited with receiving 10,801 votes. In 1985, the Workers' League named Helen Halyard once again as their candidate for mayor of Detroit. The post-Wohlforth Workers' League and Jerry Healey. The Workers' League continued to be affiliated with the National Committee of the Fourth International, headed until late 1985 by Jerry Healey. The Workers' League May Day proclamations of 1984 proclaimed the International Committee to be, quote, the World Trotskyist movement, which alone represents the historical continuity of the struggle for Marxism and the traditions of the 1917 October Revolution, which established the Soviet Union, the world's first workers' state, end quote. The Workers' League continued to follow the somewhat idiosyncratic policies of Jerry Healey and the International Committee. Among these was support for the Libyan regime of Gaddafi. At the time of the shooting of a London police officer from inside the Libyan, quote, People's Bureau, end quote, embassy, the Workers' League newspaper reprinted an article from the publication of the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Jerry Healey in Great Britain. That article started out, quote, the Tory government, the Home Office, and the Metropolitan Police planned an elaborate conspiracy to invade the Libyan People's Bureau in St. James Square last Tuesday to oust the supporters of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. How do you say that guy's name? Let's see what Google tells us. Damn it. 1 second.
Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi.
Muammar Gaddafi. Muammar Gaddafi. Sorry, let me repeat what the Jerry Healy's Workers' Revolutionary Party of Jerry Healy had to say about this. The article started out, quote, "The Tory government, the Home Office, and the Metropolitan Police planned an elaborate conspiracy to invade the Libyan People's Bureau in St. James Square last Tuesday to oust the supporters of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi and install a bunch of right-wing pro-imperialist stooges," end quote. The Workers' League also echoed Jerry Healy's vendetta against the leaders of the Socialist Workers Party, particularly Joseph Hansen and George Novak, accusing them of having been GPU and FBI agents at the time Trotsky was living in Mexico and Hansen was among his bodyguards. Thus, the Workers' League distributed a pamphlet, The Confession of Sylvia Franklin, with the subtitle, "A Socialist Workers Party Cover-Up Exposed." Yeah, that's where I heard the name Fields from, because I think the World Socialism website, or whatever it's called, their YouTube channel is full with a bunch of videos of basically accusing, I don't know, other Trotskyist organizations of being, I'm not sure all of them, and I don't remember like the details, and like I said, a lot of the organizations didn't, I don't know if I said this already, but a lot of the organizations didn't ring any bells to me at the time. It was kind of like me just kind of being introduced sort of to the topic. And, yeah, but it was basically like, yeah, that like what was said, basically just said there, that Joseph Hansen and George Novak were GPU and FBI agents. The association of the Workers' League with Jerry Healy finally came to an end in late 1985. The break occurred when in October Healy was expelled from the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Great Britain by a majority of the Workers' Revolutionary Party's Central Committee and from the International Committee of the Fourth International. In this split, the Workers' League sided with Healy's opponents, led by Cliff Slaughter and Mike Banda. To my understanding, Jerry Healy was expelled for like a pretty long list of various sexual exploitations of young socialists. I'm not sure, but I'm sorry. According to Wikipedia, to what it's worth, By then, concern as to Healy's financial, political, and intelligence links with the Libyan and Iraqi governments had risen within the party to the point at which it imploded, the final straw being assertions from Eileen Jennings, Healy's former secretary and, quote, close personal companion, end quote, over 19 years, revealed Healy's sexual abuse of female members of the WRP. On the front page of Newsline, which reappeared after 12 days' absence because of the internal dispute, Jennings wrote in an open letter that flats owned by the party were used in a, quote, completely opportunist way for sexual liaisons, end quote, by Healy, who had used his status, quote, to degrade women and girl comrades and destroy their self-respect, end quote. Healy described the allegations as a smokescreen for those who had become disappointed with revolutionary politics following the defeat of the miners' strike, although the involvement of the Workers' Revolutionary Workers Revolutionary Party in the strike was reportedly minimal. After Michael Banda, the general secretary of the party, publicly commented that Healy was probably sexually abused more than 26 women, Vanessa Redgrave said at a press conference that, quote, "These allegations are all lies, and the women who are supposed to have made them are all liars. I don't care whether it's 26, 36, or 236. They are all liars," end quote. Redgrave denounced her former colleague, quote, "This is part of a political frame-up by Mr. Banda who wants to dissolve the Workers' Revolutionary Party because he has moved to the right," end quote. Yeah, so interestingly sad shit. One of the political charges made against Healy by Banda and Slaughter was that he had accused David North, National Secretary of the Workers' League, of being a, quote, CIA agent, end quote. Soon afterward, the Workers' League periodical Bulletin noted that, quote, "The International Committee statement explained that Healy's personal degeneration was inseparable from a protracted political degeneration, ... This political degeneration provoked a struggle within the World Trotskyist movement recorded in the documents which are now being made public," end quote. The Bulletin released its own, quote, documents, end quote. It revealed that, quote, "The Workers' League raised political differences with the Workers' Revolutionary Party first in 1982 on the question of Healy's philosophical views, ... and then in 1983 to 1984 on the political line of the Workers' Revolutionary Party adopted under his leadership," end quote. However, Bulletin commented, quote, "Healy and the political committee of the Workers' Revolutionary Party refused to discuss these criticisms on either occasion. The Workers' League was compelled to withdraw the criticisms without an answer being given under threat that there would be an immediate breaking off of fraternal relations, ... end quote. As a consequence of these developments, when the split came in the ranks of the British Healyites, the Workers' League sided with Healy's opponents. The Spark Group. During the factional fight within the Spartacist League in 1968, one element of the opposition was a group attracted by what was then called Voix Ouvrière, and after 1968, Lutte Ouvrière, in France. There's a video on here about Lutte Ouvrière. It's the last section of the part of Robert J. Alexander's International Trotskyism. That's about, which is largely the last French section of the French section. The last part of the French section is all about, more or less all about Lutte Ouvrière, which I think continues to have some kind of minimal electoral success. Surprising electoral success for a Trotskyist party in France today. Or at least in the last 20 years or so. I think this thing I saw was for early 20s, but I'm not sure. They were particularly favorably impressed with the French Trotskyist group's strategy of regular preparation and distribution of leaflets directed specifically at workers in different plants and other places of employment. By 1971, this element had formally organized as the Spark. At that time, it had small groups in Baltimore and Detroit. They issued a kind of statement of principles entitled, quote, "For a Trotskyist organization in the working class," end quote. This document repeated the usual Trotskyist analysis of the rise of the, quote, bureaucracy, end quote, of the Soviet Union and consequent degeneration of the Soviet regime and the Comintern. They went on to observe, quote, the failure of the Fourth International, end quote. The document stated that, quote, "We believe that the failures of the Trotskyist organizations come from their passive adaptation to external conditions and particularly to their own original milieu. Work in the petty bourgeois arenas, which they formerly accepted as a necessity, they now proclaim to be a virtue. They pretend that Students, petty bourgeois intellectuals, and nationalist leaders are the vanguard which by its action will catalyze the working class into revolutionary consciousness." End quote. The Spark statement then defined the group's own orientation. It said that, quote, "the organization must bring together militants from the working class and militants of petty bourgeois origin who have broken with their class. But it must guard itself against ever becoming an expression of the petty bourgeois layers of society, ... Therefore, all members of the petty bourgeois origin must prove their ability to recruit and develop worker militants. If a petty bourgeois militant is unable to devote the major part of his activity to this aim or is ineffective in this work, he should be removed from all decision-making within the organization." End quote. The declaration ended, quote, "We consider ourselves part of the Trotskyist movement, but for all the above reasons, we have decided to be politically active, independent from these existing organizations." End quote. The Spark Group began in July 1971 to publish a monthly newspaper, Spark. By early 1976, this had become a bi-weekly. The announcement in Spark of this change noted that, quote, "When we began Spark, we had only 3 newsletters. Today we have 12. Our newsletters appear in auto, steel, telephone, electrical, and textile factories in Baltimore and Detroit. Our newsletters enable us to organize workers around our ideas and to get our ideas into the hands of thousands of workers, ... Alternating our bi-weekly paper with our bi-weekly newsletters means that now we can appear every week at the factories to give the views of Spark on the issues that face us." End quote. The newsletters were directed at workers in specific workplaces and dealt both with the immediate problems of those workers and with the more general ideas of the Spark Group. For instance, the, quote, "Ford Spark," end quote, newsletter of January 24th, 1978, issued for a Ford motor plant in Detroit, had a lead article entitled, quote, "Workers have the right to stop Nazis," end quote, arguing in favor of measures to close a Nazi bookstore near the plant. It also had a notice of a showing of a movie, quote, "Black Legion," end quote, about a fascist-type organization of the 1930s. The newsletter had also had short notes about the failure of the company to clean snow out of its parking lots, the fact that no new workers had been employed as had been promised when a new personnel holiday plan had been introduced, the company not giving workers advance notice of when they could have overtime, and about the Ford Company in South Africa. Finally, it had a short article on the arrest of 7 participants in a wildcat strike at the Trenton engine plant of the Chrysler Corporation. Another newsletter issued for workers of a Chrysler plant, quote, "Eldon Spark," end quote, its June 30th, 1977 number had a lead article on the front page condemning an incident in which white high school graduates had celebrated their commencement by going into a black area and beating up several people. It argued that, quote, "For white workers, there is a choice," end quote. Other notes in the newsletter dealt with the union's failure to inform new workers of their rights, overtime problems, the, quote, "squeeze on older workers," end quote, and a cartoon showing a doctor being interviewed by Chrysler Medical Hiring Board and being told that, quote, "We don't care how many degrees you have, doctor. How's your killer instinct?" End quote. In addition to their newspaper and newsletters, the Spark Group began in 1980 to publish a mimeographed magazine, Class Struggle, subtitled, quote, "A Trotskyist Quarterly," end quote. It carried longer articles reflecting the group's points of view. One in the second issue on the anti-nuclear movement commented that, quote, "Certainly today revolutionaries should support the anti-nuclear movement morally and politically. Revolutionaries should participate in the anti-nuclear movement's activities when such participation will not detract from their basic activity in the working class. But we must be clear that the building of a revolutionary organization rooted in the working class becomes before participation in any petty bourgeois movement, end quote. Class struggle indicated the Spark Group's support for the Polish Solidarity movement. The October 1981 issue had an article, Poland, What Lies Ahead for the Working Class, commenting on the first and only Congress of Solidarity. It commented that, quote, the very existence of the Congress, demonstrated the democratic rights which the Polish workers had taken for themselves in this period. That the workers have sustained their organization so long and continued to extend their demands without falling back is remarkable, end quote. Subsequent to the suppression of Solidarity, Class Struggle carried an article on that event which concluded that, quote, as long as the enemies of the working class hold the power, that is, as long as they control the state apparatus and the army, where am I? The working class has no way to guarantee it can retain what it won by its struggles, That is, the working class must fight for the one thing for power, which is the guarantee that it can keep all the other things it has won, end quote. The position of the Spark Group on, for the Trotskyist, all-important issue of the nature of the Soviet Union was markedly different from that of virtually all other U.S. Trotskyist groups, but similar to that of its French counterpart. They held that since the Soviet Union was the only country which had a genuine workers' revolution in which the workers had seized control, it was the only case which could be labeled a degenerated workers' state. As for the other Communist Party-controlled regimes, an editorial in Spark defined the situation by saying, quote, the workers were not involved in establishing these states, and these states do not represent the working class. Romania, like the rest of East Europe, is simply a bourgeois state with a poorly developed economy, end quote. By mid-1982, the Spark had local units in Detroit, Chicago, and Baltimore, and had recently established one in New York City. Internationally, Spark was associated with Lutte Ouvrière, the Lutte Ouvrière Party in France. The Turner Group. The principal element in the opposition with the Spartacist League in the factional struggle of 1968 was led by Harry Turner. They left the Socialist League at the end of that year. Upon leaving the Spartacist League, the Turner Group explored the possibility of joining forces with one or another of the other groups, claiming loyalty to Trotskyism. They first negotiated with the Workers' League, but were unable to reach agreement on a number of political points. They then joined forces with the SDS Labor Committee, headed by Lyndon LaRouche, just Google Lyndon LaRouche, which was then an open organization grouping together several different Trotskyist tendencies. However, after a short period, they followed the Spartacist League and Workers' League in withdrawing the Marxist group. From the Marxist group. Shortly thereafter, they established the Vanguard newsletter. In an early issue of the Vanguard newsletter, the group synthesized its political position. This statement said that, quote, we in Vanguard newsletter call for the building of an American section of the international Leninist and Trotskyist working class Vanguard Party on a program to unite the racially divided working class in struggle against all forms of special oppression in its own immediate and fundamental interest, and for the socialist revolution, end quote. The statement continued, quote, we call for the organization of rank-and-file or left-wing caucuses in the trade unions with this perspective incorporated into a comprehensive program of transitional demands. We believe that a network of such caucuses can develop into a leadership of the organized working class, can become at a revolutionary moment workers' councils, quote, Soviets, end quote, organs of, quote, dual power, end quote, and the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, end quote. The VNL group continued to be interested in merging with other groups. It had further discussions with the Workers' League. It also kept close track of a split then in progress within the Leninist Socialist Labor Party. The Socialist Labor Party dissidents formed a new group, Socialist Reconstruction, in August 1970, and that group expelled some of its own dissidents, who established the Socialist Forum Group. The VNL said of it that, quote, in uniting de Leon's contributions to revolutionary Marxism with those of Lenin and Trotsky, Socialist Forum has developed a program which is close to that of Vanguard newsletter on most essential questions, end quote. The two groups did not unite, however. In 1972, there was a small split in the Socialist Workers' Party. The Leninist faction withdrew and established the Class Struggle League. The VNL immediately made contact with the Class Struggle League, which had already negotiated with the Spartacist League. The VNL proposed a discussion of programmatic issues and possible unity among the three groups. The Spartacists rejected further negotiations, and the VNL and CSL agreed on unification under the Class Struggle League name. The founding convention of the new Class Struggle League evidenced two basic issues on which there was disagreement. One was whether it was possible to salvage the Fourth International or whether it was necessary to form an entirely new Fifth International. The latter view gained a majority. The second issue of disagreement was whether the East European regimes were worker states. On that subject, quote, the majority held that the buffer states became worker states when the Red Army, representing the proletarian state in a distorted form, consolidated state power in these countries, end quote. There had also been some controversy over trade union policy. However, agreement was reached that, quote, the new organization will do work in the trade unions by recruiting to revolutionary socialism, selling its newspaper and pamphlets, and helping to build rank-and-file caucuses that will lead the working class, ... The new organization, while it propagandizes for a national network of rank-and-file caucuses, does not attempt to build a national committee of such caucuses now, when there is no base for it, end quote. The United Class Struggle League lasted only about 2 years. Harry Turner and his followers soon found themselves in the minority in the leadership of the League. The split finally came in May 1975. It was thus described by the Turner faction, quote, our organization is the culmination of the internal struggle between a centrist wing, organized around the Central Committee, CC, and its revolutionary Marxist wing organized around the Bolshevik faction, which took place at the Third National Convention of the Class Struggle League. On the last day of the convention, more than half of the membership resigned from the Class Struggle League to form the Trotskyist Organizing Committee, ... end quote. Once again, the Turnerites, now the Trotskyist Organizing Committee, TOC, which had about 30 members in New York, Chicago, Texas, and San Francisco, made overtures to other Trotskyist groups. It sought agreement on 5 points: to the counter-revolutionary role of Stalinism, on international of revolutionary Marxism, the Fourth International, the validity of the transitional program, a national rank-and-file organization in the trade unions, and a labor party based on the trade unions independent of the capitalist parties. The TOC, the Trotskyist Organizing Committee, made contacts with the Socialist Workers Party, promising to conform to Socialist Workers Party discipline if the Trotskyist Organizing Committee if it was possible for it to present its point of view 3 months before conventions. The Socialist Workers Party turned down these overtures. Among the other tendencies with which the TOC negotiated were the Thornet Group in the United States, the Socialist League, Democratic Centralist, and the Spark Group. Finally, in 1978, the Trotskyist Organizing Committee was invited by Mike Bartel of Los Angeles to become part of the Committee for a Revolutionary Socialist Party, an umbrella group of several smaller organizations. As a consequence, on November 16, 1978, a statement by the Trotskyist Organizing Committee under the masthead of the Trotskyist Organizing Committee's periodical Socialist Appeal announced that, quote, as a result of these discussions and attendance at the first national CRSP conference of an observer, we in the TOC have decided to join the CRSP. We have therefore dissolved the TOC and ended the publication of Socialist Appeal, ... end quote. Soon after the TOC joined the CRSP, the latter decided to become a separate political organization rather than a united front. As a consequence, the TOC once more withdrew. The TOC also became the Revolutionary Unity League. The Revolutionary Unity League once again entered into negotiations with another group in 1981. In this case, it was the Revolutionary Workers Front, the United States affiliate of the faction of the Fourth International headed by the Argentine Nahuel Moreno. The two groups merged at a convention in July 1982 to establish... Oh, come on. Are you fucking with me? 1 second. I have like 2 sentences left to read in the goddamn thing. And the fucking Adobe Acrobat, shits out. Anyway, the two groups merged at a convention in July 1982 to establish the Internationalist Workers Party, Fourth International, which is discussed in the following chapter. All right. Thanks for listening.